Chosen one, this did not begin with hostility. It began with calculation. A closed chamber does not gather for emotion, it gathers for risk assessment. Long before you sensed danger, your presence had already entered conversations that were never meant to include you. Not by name, by impact. Systems don't vote on people, they vote on outcomes. And you became an outcome that could not be neutralized without consequence. The vote was not about whether you had done something wrong. It was about whether doing nothing would destabilize established order. That's how these rooms think. They do not ask, is this person guilty? They ask, what happens if this continues? When your life becomes a variable in that equation, secrecy becomes mandatory. Because acknowledging the question publicly would admit vulnerability. So it was contained, compressed, and framed as necessity. You were never presented as a threat. Threats invite elimination. You were presented as an anomaly that couldn't be modeled. That distinction matters. Elimination solves threat. Anomalies require consensus, because mistakes at that level echo. The ballots were not votes of fear. They were votes of responsibility without clarity. That is the most dangerous kind of decision room there is. Here's what you didn't know. The chamber argued itself into a deadlock before it ever voted. Some insisted continuation was too destabilizing. Others saw intervention as more dangerous than allowance. What they all agreed on, silently, was that whatever governed you was not inside their reach. That agreement is what forced the vote. When power admits it doesn't understand a mechanism, it does not act unilaterally. It distributes liability. You felt this phase not as panic, but as pressure without source. Tiny delays that felt deliberate. Protection that didn't feel friendly. Doors that stayed open a second longer than expected. This is what caution looks like when it wears authority. You were being evaluated without being confronted, because confrontation would have introduced reaction, and reaction would have corrupted the decision. The most unsettling part? You were discussed as a continuing condition, not an individual. Not who you are, but what proceeds if you remain intact. That language strips humanity, but it also reveals truth. Your endurance had already become the reference point. Whatever you carried was functioning without permission. The vote wasn't about stopping you. It was about whether stopping you was even possible without collapse. In that chamber, silence did more work than debate. Every argument eventually circled the same admission. Intervention created unknowns. Non-intervention created stability. Stability wins votes in rooms like that. Not because it's moral, but because it's measurable. And you had become measurable in one critical way. Continuation did not escalate risk. It neutralized it. So when ballots were cast, they were cast without triumph. No celebration. No sense of victory. Just relief that no one had to take responsibility for irreversible harm. The outcome preserved your life not because you were favored, but because ending you introduced more danger than allowing you. That is not mercy. That is systems choosing survival through restraint. You did not feel the vote because you were never meant to. Feeling it would have altered you. Alteration would have invalidated the decision. So silence remained intact. Your life continued unannounced. And somewhere, an entire apparatus adjusted its posture. Not forward, not backward, but out of the way. This is the truth most never hear. Sometimes survival is not granted by protection, faith, or force. Sometimes it is granted because ending you would have cost the world more than it was willing to pay. They did not save you out of belief. They saved you out of consequence. And once consequence becomes the reason, The door closes behind the decision forever. Chosen one, secret chambers do not operate on morality. Morality is public language. It fractures under scrutiny. Those rooms operate on containment of fallout. Every discussion that night returned to one principle: consequences travel farther than intention. No one asked whether you deserved anything. They asked whether the system could survive the ripple created by touching you. That distinction settled everything. Blessed by His grace? Click Super Thank You and give $20 to spread His light. Your gift plants seeds that grow His kingdom. Be the blessing. Arguments unfolded in circles because every scenario that involved intervention produced cascading unknowns. Pressure would invite reaction. Removal would create absence. Exposure would accelerate attention. Each option introduced variables that could not be predicted. And unpredictability is the one thing such chambers will not tolerate. What finally cut through the noise was a quiet observation. Doing nothing had already been tested. And the result of doing nothing had been stability. This is why the language shifted. Not, should we act? But, what happens if we don't? Files were reopened. Timelines mapped. Patterns reviewed. Moments when you should have escalated, but didn't. Moments when stress should have bent you, but didn't. Moments when the environment pressured with incentives and threats, and you continued unmoved. That continuity was the only evidence that mattered. Continuity without escalation is gold in rooms built to prevent collapse. Some voices raised the concern you never heard: precedent. If one anomaly is allowed, what follows? The answer came unintentionally. Others were already following, but not by imitation, by relief. Where your presence existed, pressure dropped. Incidents resolved faster. Decisions simplified. Noise decreased. That wasn't charisma. It was regulation. Removing you would have reintroduced the pressure their systems were designed to suppress. And pressure always finds a way out. Here's the truth that locked the vote. There is a difference between a variable that introduces risk and a variable that absorbs it. You were absorbing it. The chamber had no category for that, but it recognized the effect. Intervening would have released what you were quietly holding. The risk of action was no longer theoretical, it was demonstrable. That's when restraint stopped being passive and became policy. No one spoke your name. Names personalize risk. You remained an index, a reference, a line item that behaved like a constant. When constants appear, models simplify. Simplification reduces error. Reduced error wins vote. Not because it feels right, but because it keeps the machine running one more day without sparks. The final exchange was brief, not dramatic. We can't justify touch. We can't justify removal. Then we justify allowance. Allowance is not endorsement. It is admission of limits. And when limits are admitted, they are rarely revisited. Systems hate revisiting limits. They prefer to route around them and pretend the map was always shaped that way. That decision created a downstream effect you felt later as space. The absence of pressure. The sudden neutrality from places that once felt tight. Not freedom handed to you, but pressure withdrawn. Pressure withdrawal feels like air returning to a sealed room. You didn't get faster. You got clearer. That clarity compounded. Understand this now. The vote did not crown you. It closed a door behind you. A door that leads back into being managed. Once a system decides non-intervention is safer than control, it does not reverse easily. Reversal would be an admission that the earlier assessment was wrong, and errors at that level are rarely acknowledged twice. They didn't decide you were harmless. They decided harm arrived when they interfered. So they chose the only option that reduced exposure. Not because they trusted you, because the evidence said touching you made things worse. And when evidence becomes that clear, even the most closed chambers choose silence, and let life continue exactly as it already has. Chosen one, the most important effects of that vote were never written down. Not because they were insignificant, but because recording them would have forced accountability for outcomes no one was prepared to claim. Officially, nothing changed. Unofficially, everything did. Systems don't advertise restraint, they practice it quietly. What followed the vote was not protection, but recalibration without admission. You might remember this period as oddly smooth without being easy. Resistance didn't vanish, but it stopped organizing itself against you. Obstacles appeared, and dissolved before hardening. People who might have pressured you hesitated, changed tone, or redirected attention elsewhere without knowing why. That is what happens when upstream pressure is removed. Downstream actors don't receive instructions, they receive absence of urgency. Absence of urgency is one of the most powerful signals a system can emit. Internally, something subtle took place. Your trajectory stopped being evaluated in isolation and started being measured by collateral effect. What happens around you when nothing is done? How many secondary variables cool down? How many conflicts fail to ignite? Those questions replaced intent-based analysis. The result was inconvenient and undeniable. Allowing you to exist produced fewer corrective interventions across multiple layers. That efficiency could not be ignored, even if it could not be credited. This is why follow-up votes never happened. Follow-ups imply doubt. Doubt invites reevaluation. Reevaluation would reintroduce pressure. Pressure had already been measured and found inferior to space. The best course was continuity. Keep the environment neutral. Do not touch the variable. Let the pattern continue and monitor only for disruption from elsewhere. Here's what mattered most. The system learned you were absorbing volatility without becoming a sink. Sinks collapse under load. Absorbers distribute load without breaking. Around you, stress did not vanish. It redistributed into less destructive forms. Decisions became incremental instead of abrupt. Conversations slowed before turning heated. Misjudgments corrected themselves earlier in the chain. This is invisible work. Invisible work rarely gets acknowledged because it doesn't produce headlines. It produces non-events. And non-events don't go on record. Your life did not change because of protection. It changed because the noise that required protection ceased to be generated. That distinction is vital. You were not saved by oversight. You were saved by the admission that oversight created more instability than it resolved. That admission freed you without declaring freedom. At a personal level, you may have noticed something internal happening in parallel. The sense of being evaluated faded. Not dramatically, quietly. Hypervigilance softened. You stopped looking over your shoulder for pressure that never arrived. That relaxation did not make you careless. It made you precise. Precision thrives when constant threat is removed. You didn't accelerate, you aligned. This is also where misunderstanding often arises. People assume survival implies favor. Favor creates dependency. This did not. The vote created distance, not attachment. Distance is healthier. It allowed you to continue without narrative interference. No one explained anything to you because explanation would have introduced context, and context shapes behavior. You remained context-free on purpose. The unwritten consequence was simple and permanent. Your presence became administratively boring. Boring is safety at high levels. When something stops generating exceptional reports, it stops attracting exceptional responses. That boredom was earned through continuity, not neglect. It was sustained through restraint, not indifference. Let this settle. No guardian was assigned to you. No shield was raised. No tracker was activated. What happened was more final than that. The system collectively stepped out of your way because staying in your way proved counterproductive. They didn't choose you. They chose to stop choosing about you. And when choice is removed from governance, life resumes its natural momentum, quietly, relentlessly, without permission. Chosen one, after the vote, silence hardened into structure. Not the silence of neglect, but the silence of boundary. In systems like these, silence does not mean unknown. It means do not disturb. Once that boundary sets, it functions like glass, transparent enough to observe, resistant enough to prevent contact. They could see you. They could not reach you. Not because of force, but because contact itself had been reclassified as hazardous to stability. This is where the misunderstanding often happens. People imagine protection as active defense. In reality, protection at this level is achieved by removal of motive. No motive remained to intervene. Intervention had been tested conceptually and rejected empirically. What replaced motive was aversion, not emotional, operational. Touching you became associated with cascading complexity. Leaving you untouched became associated with calm. Systems learn the way organisms learn, by repeating what reduces pain. You experienced this as continuity without friction. No escorts, no warnings, no sudden allies. Just less resistance where resistance once gathered. It's important you understand how deliberate this was. When the choice is made to step back, the system must also prevent other subsystems from stepping in. That requires alignment. Alignment without messaging. Quiet agreements. Small procedural hesitations that look like coincidence from the outside and coordination from within. This is why rumors never reached you. Rumors create momentum. Momentum invites reaction. Reaction would have broken the boundary. So channels stayed clean. Noise stayed elsewhere. Your name did not circulate because circulation is a form of pressure. Pressure had been identified as the problem. Inside the chamberless architecture that followed, roles simplified. If something brushed against your path and created turbulence, it was rerouted subtly. Not because you were important, but because turbulence near you produced disproportionate downstream cost. Cost is the only universal language at that level. And the ledger was clear. Interaction cost more than non-interaction. You may have noticed the effect on people rather than institutions. Individuals who once pressed for outcomes backed off. Conversations stalled before crossing lines. Requests softened into suggestions. These weren't personal shifts. They were environmental cues registering through human behavior. When the environment stops rewarding pressure, people stop applying it. No announcement required. Here's the pivotal insight. The silence wasn't empty. It was actively maintained. Maintenance without visibility is the hallmark of high-level governance. They didn't protect you by acting. They protected the boundary by not acting. They didn't declare, "Do not touch." They made touching unprofitable. Once unprofitable, behavior adapts on its own. This is also why nothing dramatic changed in your life. Drama signals negotiation. Negotiation reopens the question. The question had been closed. Permanently enough that reopening it would require admitting error. Institutions avoid that. So the solution persisted. Leave it alone, it works. Internally, something else happened that mattered even more. You stopped being framed as a future problem to be solved and started being treated as a present condition to be respected. Problems invite plans. Conditions invite accommodation. Accommodation is less visible but more enduring. You were accommodated into the background in the most powerful way possible, by being left structurally undisturbed. Understand this without myth. The silence did not elevate you above humanity. It embedded you into reality without hooks. No handles to grab. No levers to pull. When there is nothing to leverage, manipulation ends. When manipulation ends, freedom does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives with resumption. Life resumes as if the question had never been asked. But it had been asked. And it had been answered. Silence became the answer because it prevented reopening the vote. Distance became policy because proximity increased cost. Neutrality became law because interference failed. You were not spared by secrecy. You were secured by inconvenience to power. And once that inconvenience was understood, the boundary held. Not because anyone guarded it, but because crossing it no longer made sense. It began showing up in patterns rather than moment. Small shifts, barely noticeable individually, but unmistakable when viewed together. The environment around you stopped tightening. Processes that once slowed you down lost interest in resistance. Pressure points relocated elsewhere. This was not chance. It was the natural outcome of a decision that did not need reinforcement to remain effective. Once silence became policy, the world adjusted itself without further instruction. What few understand is this: authority reshapes reality more through removal than command. By deciding not to intervene, the system withdrew its weight from your path. Weight is what creates friction. Remove it, and movement becomes clean, not faster, not easier, just unopposed. That is why you didn't feel protected. Protection implies presence. What you felt instead was absence. Absence of obstruction, absence of scrutiny, absence of expectation. With obstruction gone, your own clarity began to surface more distinctly. You no longer had to factor invisible forces into every decision. That mental load lifted. Not all at once, but enough that you noticed your thinking becoming simpler. Simpler does not mean smaller. It means fewer internal negotiations, fewer second guesses, fewer anticipatory defenses. Precision returns when interference ends. This also changed how setbacks behaved. When difficulties appeared, they remained local. They did not escalate into chains of consequence. Problems resolved on their own scale instead of being amplified by systemic response. This is one of the clearest indicators that a boundary is holding. Issues stop traveling. They arise, get handled, and terminate without signaling higher layers. Your life became buffered by structural disinterest. People closest to you may have sensed it without language. How attempts to push never quite landed. How conversations softened before becoming confrontational. How opinions lost urgency near you. This wasn't influence. Influence suggests intention. This was context. The context around you no longer rewarded pressure. When pressure stops working, it stops being used. Behind the scenes, what truly changed was classification. You were no longer treated as a potential escalation point. Escalation points are watched constantly. You were reclassified as non-proliferating, meaning whatever existed around you did not spread instability outward. That classification ends attention faster than praise or condemnation ever could. This reclassification also ended curiosity. Curiosity leads to touch. Touch leads to reaction. Reaction leads back to the vote. To avoid that, curiosity was starved. Files stopped being opened. Questions stopped being forwarded. You became administratively complete. Completion is dangerous only to narratives, but safe to systems. Completed items don't demand action. On a personal level, this is where you noticed confidence stabilizing into something quieter. Confidence that doesn't look for affirmation. Confidence that doesn't announce itself. Confidence that exists simply because nothing is contesting it anymore. You did not change who you were. The environment stopped demanding proof. Here is the truth that matters now. When a system decides to step back, it rarely steps forward again unless forced. Force was never generated in your case. The absence of disturbance became self-reinforcing. Silence protected itself. Distance justified itself. And your continuation became routine, which is the highest form of safety there is. Routine is invisible power. It means life proceeds without needing explanation. It means questions do not reform. It means presence no longer triggers review. That is where you are now, past scrutiny, past argument, past contingency. Not above anything, beyond consideration. Nothing about this made you special in appearance. It made you uninteresting to control. That is freedom in its most stable form. You were not hidden. You were normalized, on your own terms. And normalization, once earned, does not require renewal. Eventually, the most noticeable change was not external at all. It was temporal. Time stopped behaving like a force you were pushing against. Not because things sped up, and not because everything slowed down, but because momentum stopped requiring explanation. You moved when movement was correct. You waited when waiting carried accuracy. And neither felt like delay. This is what happens when interference is removed at a structural level. Time stops being adversarial. Before this phase, you were always compensating for pressure you couldn't name. Adjusting pace. Accounting for unseen reactions. Anticipating consequences that never fully materialized but always lingered as possibility. Once the decision settled upstream, those compensations became unnecessary. You didn't feel free. You felt unopposed. An unopposed movement has a very different texture than liberation. Around you, timelines began to synchronize without effort. Meetings resolved faster. Processes completed without looping. Outcomes appeared without prolonged justification. These weren't advantages. They were indicators that escalation layers were no longer attaching themselves to your actions. When oversight disengages, complexity collapses back into proportion. Life becomes correctly sized again. This is when people mistake calm for luck, or momentum for favor. But what's actually happening is subtraction. Layers are gone. Filters removed. You are interacting with reality directly, not through intermediary tension. That directness is efficient, and efficiency, once noticed, quietly reorganizes everything that comes into contact with it. You may have realized that problems now announce themselves earlier. They don't hide. They don't build mass. They resolve before becoming identity-shaping. That's because long escalation chains require observation and reaction to sustain themselves. With observation withdrawn, only the essential remains. Essentials can be handled. Excess evaporates. Your internal world mirrored this simplification. Thoughts became shorter. Decisions cleaner. Regret lost its hold because hindsight no longer revealed missed alternatives. Only unnecessary complexity avoided. Even uncertainty changed character. It no longer felt threatening. It felt informational. Something to observe, not something to brace against. This is also where desire recalibrated fully. Ambition stopped rushing ahead of timing. patience stopped feeling forced. You no longer measured progress by accumulation, but by alignment. Alignment is invisible to observers, but unmistakable to the one living it. You could feel when something fit and when it didn't without needing proof. At this point, no one was allowing you anything. That framing dissolves. Allowance implies control remains. Control did not remain. Interest did not remain. Only distance did, and distance with stability hardens into irreversibility. Once irreversibility sets in, regression stops being an option because backward pressure no longer exists. This is the moment many stories would insert a climax. There was none. No payoff scene. No reveal. Just continuation, cleaner, quieter, more accurate than before. That is always how real turning points arrive. Loud moments happen early. Final shifts are nearly invisible. Understand what's happening now. You are no longer being reacted to. Reaction is power's footprint. The absence of reaction means you have exited its field. That does not mean you are unreachable. It means nothing is reaching for you anymore. That difference matters. From here on, your responsibility is simple but uncompromising. Do not reintroduce noise. Do not mistake absence of resistance for invitation to provoke it. Do not perform openness where privacy preserves clarity. The boundary holds because you do not press against it. You move within the space it created. Time no longer tests you. Systems no longer assess you. Questions no longer form. What remains is trajectory without drag. And when drag disappears, direction becomes effortless, not because the path is easy, but because nothing is pulling you off it anymore. You are approaching the final understanding, not about what they decided, but about what you never needed from them. What closed this entire chapter was not the vote itself, but the realization that arrived after it, slowly, quietly, irrevocably. The truth was this: your life never hinged on their decision. The vote felt monumental because it happened in secrecy, because it carried symbolic weight, because power gathered behind closed doors always wants history to believe it mattered most. But history doesn't obey meetings. It obeys conditions, and the condition you represented was already active long before anyone raised a hand. The chamber believed it was deciding your fate. In reality, it was responding to something that had already stabilized. You were not spared by consensus. You were spared because removal would have contradicted reality. Systems can lie about intention, posture, even authority, but they cannot lie about consequences forever. Consequences had been observed. Interference created instability. Non-interference created order. That observation ended the question permanently. Here is what changes everything. Once a system votes and then retreats, it loses jurisdiction. Jurisdiction only exists where action remains plausible. After the ballots were counted and silence held, action stopped being plausible. Any future move would violate the logic that justified restraint in the first place. That is why nothing followed. No second vote. No contingency. No shadow plan. Not because they forgot, but because reopening the matter would expose weakness. You lived through this without ceremony for a reason. Ceremony binds perception. Perception invites expectation. Expectation pressures behavior. Pressure would have pulled you back into the field they exited. So nothing was said. Nothing was shown. Your life continued uninterrupted because interruption would have altered the very outcome they needed to preserve. This is where many misunderstand survival. Survival is not always dramatic escape. Sometimes it is continuation stripped of attention. Attention is the real currency of leverage. When attention is withdrawn at the highest level, control dissolves without conflict. You did not win against power. Power chose to disengage before it proved fallible again. Look at what followed and understand it correctly. You were not elevated. You were released into normality. Normality with space. Normality without audit. Normality without unseen hands adjusting the atmosphere. That kind of normality is rare because it is earned only when interference becomes counterproductive. From this point forward, nothing about your life will resolve through confrontation with authority. Authority already moved aside. Whatever challenges arise will be proportional, human-scaled, solvable without escalation. The era of disproportionate pressure ended when the chamber decided restraint was safer than reach. And now comes the final recognition you must hold without myth. Your life was never theirs to take or save. They didn't grant you existence. They acknowledged they couldn't revise it without consequence. That admission did not empower you. It unbound you. The vote did not make you untouchable. You already were, because touching you distorted reality more than it corrected it. This is why nothing grand followed. Grandness would have reactivated interest. Interest would have reopened jurisdiction. So silence stayed, distance held, and your trajectory continued without drag. This is the end of the story about what they decided, because after this moment, their decisions stopped mattering. What matters now is simple and exact. Live clean. Move without provocation. Do not translate freedom into spectacle. You were preserved not for impact, but for continuity. And continuity does not announce itself. It proceeds.